coming here to be part of the audience, but suddenly I'm thrust into the spotlight for the first part of this. It's basically to introduce it. Thank you everybody for coming, and I think it's a testament to Dawn that we're all here for this event. And the event is to celebrate and inform us all about Dawn in Wonderland and other stories. This fantastic book that Brian Chalkley has masterminded for Dawn. And we're looking now for Tony Grisoni, who is going to read something from the book. You're part of it. Yep. So if you follow me onto this, we'll kind of get underway. And once Tony's finished, we're going to have a panel discussion that Dawn is going to be in charge of. Yes?
I think Tony might be part of the panel discussion, as everybody should come to the panel now, and then we work from there.
Okay.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please. So if the panel collect, please.
So that's the panel there. They're the panel. We're the audience. Sit down.
Yes. Well, it is supposed to be research. So I thought we were making research.
We're perfectly researchy. So I'll hand over to you to start off. Thanks very much.
I think it's too short. I mean, I could stand, but...
Do you want to be on the panel?
Of course I want to know. Oh. I don't know if you've ever seen, I was talking to Dave lunchtime, and we were reminiscing about a really interesting interview that Andy Warhol gave, it's probably the 60s or something, wasn't it? And he had a kind of very beautiful drag queen called Candy Darling, and she was amazing and beautiful looking. And there was a critic, I don't remember the name of the critic. No, there was a critic, and it was like a kind of, a conventional interview, art critic, artist kind of interview. Anyway, so Andy Warhol is sitting there, and he's got beautiful Candy Darling next to him. And so the interviewer says, so Andy, tell me a bit about, I mean, I'm slightly making this up, but no, the major factor in it is not made up. And so he says, tell me a bit about the content in your work and that. And Andy goes, what do you think, Candy? And she goes, oh, Andy, I don't know. I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, I haven't got really a view on it. I mean, what is content, And it just went on like that, so it was a complete rebuff of this kind of so-called, can I use the word research in here? I suppose this is research. But anyway, we're going to sort of open up and have a weird, and I think probably amazing discussion. We've got some wonderful people here. We've got Alex Sainsbury on the far right, and who runs Raven Row Gallery, and has put on some amazing shows. And then we've got Dr. Sadie Murdoch, I should say, got the official name, who's also teaching here, and wrote a brilliant dissertation on, I'm just saying briefly, on drag and so forth, and it was an amazing piece of work. So we've always had that kind of connection. I've known Sadie for many years as a student down in Bagby's Lane. Well, no one will know what that was, but anyway. And then we have in the middle here Tony Grisoni, who I met when I did the Rome Scholarship in Rome. In Rome, you wouldn't. I mean, and I think I was 89. One of the things is about Rome and meeting Tony was, well, it was a wonderful conversation. We met in this strange apartment, I think, but I always remember the apartment. And he was with his partner Una, and we just had a kind of strange sort of, I don't know, discussion, conversation, dialogue, whatever you call it, but it was all kind of a bit hit and miss, and we just kind of bit of a kind of satellite situation. And then when I did this book, this is the second book in fact, because the first book had, which was called Dawn in Wonderland, had Sadie and Dave both writing it, and writing in very, very different ways, and you might reflect on that. But going back to the recent book, and I said to, well, Tony always said, well, maybe we should work together sometime. I said, that would be brilliant. And then it's like typical me, I'm all in a rush, and I was just showing to us of all this stuff. And anyway, we've got this book, and I wanted to do it, this show, and I just said to Tony, do you think you could write something? And he went, yeah, all right. Anyway, time went on. I said, have you written it yet? He said, no. I said, oh, God. Anyway, so he said, a really interesting thing. He said, do you know where Lee Valley? Yeah, Lee Valley and Stamford Hill, round there, yeah, London. So he said, meet me there at 3 o'clock. So this is like a H.G. Wells story, I think, or something. Anyway, I thought, oh God, what's going to happen? So 3 o'clock, and I stand with my cup of tea. There's a very nice cafe there. And I have my cup of tea, and I'm standing on the shore like this, and I'm going, what the fuck is it, And anyway, dead on 3, I see this spot in the far right, coming down the river. And I think, it's like madman going a boat or something. And this madman turned out to be Tony. And he bought a boat, a rowing boat. And so he just comes alongside and says, jump in. And I take my seat, jump in the boat. And we have this wonderful kind of, I don't know, conversation. And we didn't talk about art once, which was brilliant. And we just talked, well, I can't remember, but out of that, I think, came Tony's story, which is split into 10 parts across the book. This is such a long introduction, I'm really sorry. So anyway, so that's going to be, maybe, if we're lucky, we might get the author of that to read, because that's quite special. And then, I don't think this man needs any introduction. I didn't know he was going to wear a pink jacket today. I've always had my doubts, But this is an extremely intellectual Dave Beach, and wonderful teacher as he is, and we worked together for many years. And I remember that Matthew Higgs brought Dave Beach into Chelsea. And Matthew, at one point, was bringing artists in and to do talks and so forth. Now I'm working in New York, White Columns. And so Dave sat down at this table. It was in a funny place. It wasn't at Chelsea here, it was in the old side. And Dave sat down. And I said, what's he going to talk about then, Matthew? I'd never heard of him. He said, I think he's going to talk about Heidegger. I went, what? I said, he hasn't got any notes. He hasn't got a book. He sat and talked about Heidegger. I may be wrong, but I'm sure it was over an hour and a half and he didn't stop. And there weren't any questions because no one knew a fuck about it. But it sounded really impressive. So I always remember that. And now Dave is here with us after a funny journey of here. And then I've got Stephen Wilson, who's just flown back from where? Sicily, yeah. My memory's gone. And it's so wonderful to have him here. And I saw he's done wonderful work with the theory department at Chelsea on the MA course, and brought some amazing people in to speak, and a brilliant, brilliant lecture series, which I think is extraordinary in the fact, which I love, it always ends with an answer and question. And I think the answer and question brings me to the panel now, and they can begin.
We're all worried now because we can't match that introduction. Now you've raised your anticipation so high, we're going to reduce it. I'm going to read, I might read all of it, but I might save you just read some of the text I wrote. It was funny because, as Brian said, you know, we knew one another, and I think we were do the washing up as well.
Yeah.
And I think what we were talking about a lot in around was the stories, really.
Yeah.
And I think there's a big connection there. But I think one of the things that really interests me about Brian's take on stories is I think he's really interested in what we don't tell, and the bits we leave out. Anyway, as he said to me, would you like to write something for this book? And I said, yeah, I'd love to. And what do you want? And he said, oh, I don't know anything. And so I had no idea what I was going to write at all. And that's why I didn't write anything for a long time until he phoned up and was chasing me. And I still didn't know what I was going to do, but I thought, well, let's go for a row up the River Lee. And so we did that. And then I went back after that and went and wrote this little piece, which is called Downstream. Gloom was not his real name. He had purloined the moniker from Facebook to mask a careless life of lost loves and paths untaken. Some nights he wondered if the real Gloom would discover the theft. No doubt there must be other Glooms out there. Would they gather, a cloud of Glooms? Would they come looking for him? The light was fading when he pushed out the boat. Sun low, trees black. A deflated football floats past. A tarry coop with wrong plastic feet, stock still on the black tide. Twig and nylon nest, eggs, blue-white in the slowly flooding dark. Gloom rose. Opposite him, Mrs. Gloom gazes at the drifting detritus, unaware that her husband has secretly unbaptized her. She had fallen for him, even though he was a coarse man. He'd lost part of a finger in the boatyard, so much blood. His own fault, always rushing things, letting the boy roll his head. She knew he was eyeing up the girl. She knew without looking. A brown girl with pretty dreads, scything her skiff upstream. 15 seconds at my best. She smiled at the odd couple in their tub, the dreaming lady and the scowling man. There goes one of the marriages I never had. When had he got old? The barge had been a washout. A tiny little boat indeed. He had been cheated. She knew it, he knew it, but she didn't fancy facing his anger. He'd had a drink. So she said nothing. Her silences. When Lady A leaped, he talked about giving her a coat of paint. It's going to be brown and cream like a railway carriage. Can't finish the job now because of the weather. She said nothing. Women don't like boats, unless they're in the Bahamas. Good old Arthur. His named snigger drew her eyes. She thought he looked a Nancy boy, his grimy trousers and his sweater set off with a jaunty neck scarf, a silver ring etched with a fox head. And why was he wearing that hat? Here they come, Mr. and Mrs. Gloom gliding on the canal. Mr. Gloom rowing easily downstream, Mrs. smiling at the world past. They slip beneath a low bridge like a letterbox. Movie lights on the water. Film voices echo from the bank. It's lovely on the water to hear the music play. It makes the gloom still. It makes them silent. But if I had my way, my dearest love, along with you, I'd stay. My husband doesn't talk much, do you? He doesn't. I do. He was a nice young man. A day tripper, a visitor, not a marina resident. They shared a cider. His eyes were bright with the outside world. It made a change from moaning about how the place had become a slum since the Boy Scouts had moved out and nobody grew flowers anymore. It used to be a lovely corner. It's a fucking laboratory now. Look at it. She comes in silence out of nowhere. A battered old launch with a white pit bull at the bow. Got any gold? Got any rum? Any joke. He is bare-chested, big hoop earring, top hat, wolfish green, mouth and trousers. He motors abreast of the glooms for a distance, but distrusts the silence. Don't go outside of my boat. Is that one of the music? It always happens. It's amazing. He gradually falls behind, melting into the past river. Knows he's had a lucky break. The stenciled transom rose is the last thing to fade. A dark curve of the canal where the plane trees hide the city. A dim paraffin lantern glimmers. The glooms glide in. No electric lights on at the pub. Nobody at the outdoor tables. Strange on a warm evening like this. They can just make out two motionless figures on the tow path, a full fathom 5 apart. Mr. Gloom sits beside a thin tattooed man with a face accustomed to staring down at frying eggs. She always paid the electric, she always did. Not this time she did. Typical, can't trust him. But the tattooed man doesn't want to play. He is too tired. Unaccountably, he suddenly wants to sleep. His pale wife wears a dirty pink t-shirt that says, "A princess lives here." She is stabbing the dark water with her eyes. Mrs. Bloom shares a fag with her. Dave's a chef, really. He doesn't know about running a pub, the business of it. He's a chef. How would he know? Mrs. Bloom is a good listener. She listens to the sound of Dave's wife bludgeoning her own knife. How would he know? He's a chef. Mrs. Bloom echoes the tale of the two handmaidens and how they ingratiated themselves with the monster queen. Who is this who understands me so well? The princess meets Mrs. Bloom's bird-bright eye. She feels herself drained silently into the canal and be drawn on the downstream surge, lost forever. Rowing back was harder. He had gone so far, and the current was strong. Must be the rain earlier. It pours out of every car park in the state between here and Loch. Both smile inwardly, sharing joy in the sudden spiteful wind. We'll get a few cans in front of the telly. Batteries all charged up. She touches his shoulder, and Gloom rows vigorously against the flood. And that's it. I've got to say that... I didn't have the slightest clue what it was about, but it was a real joy to write. And it was a real joy to write not knowing what it was about. And when I read it at the end, I thought it might be about two middle-aged vampires.
I think it's very appropriate. Thank you very much, Tony. Well done. Where would you, well, I think I think it's interesting because Tony, forgive me if I get it wrong, but he's very well known as a screenwriter, and I think that relationship between writing and filmic narrative is very interesting, and I think that that's something Dave and I touched on a little bit at lunchtime, whereby we talked about not necessarily narrative in painting, but maybe slightly the difference between that and maybe what a kind of filmic narrative was. I just wondered if we could get that back on the screen, because that painting is kind of quite important in terms of the figure in relation to the narrative and the background, and also in the drawings maybe in a different kind of way. And just to say a little bit about those paintings is that they all evolved through the image and the desire in a way to be that person. And then something very monumental happened, which is always a great privilege if it happens in your work. I think that was the shock of thinking, hold on, there's something wrong, and locating what it is that's wrong. And I suddenly thought, my God, there's no background. So that in itself led to a kind of an oasis, if you like, of possibilities, in the sense that suddenly I'm thinking, who is this person? Where are they? What do they do? What is their location? So I then started to look at a whole series of locations and invent a narrative around this person, but not a narrative in the sense that we might have several figures or whatever going on, but a kind of filmic narrative in a way that seems to be like a frame or something caught in a time zone frame where the frame is going to move on, but we're just stuck with this particular frame, so you don't quite know what's happening on the right or the left. And I think, well, maybe we could Dave, I think you could continue from that a little bit. Maybe I'm completely wrong about it.
So we had lunch today, and I asked Brian when he did his degree in painting,
Yes.
what did his tutors think about narrative? And he said they never talked about it, ever. It was one of those things that you don't talk about on a painting course. Maybe on other courses you talk about narrative, but not on this course.
Not at Chelsea.
But I think not
In that
anywhere would you talk about narrative. But certainly, well, in the second half of the 20th century, you wouldn't talk about narrative in painting. Because it had been wiped out. You know, there was always something slightly creepy and nostalgic and simplistic. For this particular kind of modernist idea of painting, there was something wrong about narrative in painting. And then I'm sure everybody has got their own personal favourite narrative painter. If we said narrative painting, you would have something in mind, maybe a pre-Raphaelite painter, maybe Paul Rego, or for me when I was a student, Stephen Campbell, who made the kind of paintings that we were told you shouldn't make. And so you've got this issue then about whether these painters were wrong. Did they not understand that you weren't supposed to do this? Or were they doing it precisely because you were told not to do this? And they were trying to find out how much you could do before it all stopped. And that, in a sense, becomes a taboo. It becomes a block on us thinking about a broader sense of the relationship between painting and narrative. Because one of the things that is different between Brian Dawn and Paul Rego is we don't look at the narrative within Paul Rego paintings via thinking about the narrative of Paul Rego. Whereas with Brian Dawn, the narrative of Brian and the narrative of Dawn are essential to the narrative of the painting. So we've got this other level of narrative which is integral. And so it's not just about what's within the frame. And I know Brian's trying to say that it's just about what's in the frame. And I'm trying to say it's not about what's in the frame. The narrative is something stronger than that. The narrative is more like an approach, more like a rationale. And so I just want to say a few things about what narrative is in order to understand how narrative might work in painting in a way that doesn't just default to that old-fashioned idea of narrative painting. That is the narrative within the painting. So just the basic thing that I want to say really is narrative is just a way of organising information. All right? So we're in a library. The information within the library is organised alphabetically and in terms of subject and in terms of a particular kind of system. All right? That's one way of organising this collection. But you could organise the collection differently. And one of the ways that you could reorganise all of these books and all of these CDs and all of the DVDs and everything else that we've got here is by making a narrative in which they all participate. We could do that. It would take quite a while because there's a big collection. But it could be organised according to narrative. Right? And that narrative doesn't have to be chronological. That's a slightly different ordering of things. Narrative organises things so that not only do the individual things relate to each other within a structure, each thing next to each thing relates to it too. So there's a sense to the sequence, not just a sense to the whole. Whereas if you go there now and look along that book, the only sense you've got is, for instance, just there, I think, they're books on aesthetics. And the system that you've got along there is all of that area is aesthetics, and there's no reason for the second one to be next to the first one. It could be the 10th one. So the sequence doesn't make sense. It's the category that makes sense. So narrative makes sense in a sequence. Now, what you get in conventional narrative painting is the depiction of a moment within a sequence, which is the way that Don's been talking about it just now. But if we think about sequences making sense through narrative, there are other kinds of sequences that don't make sense, or they make sense in other ways that are not narrative. So, for instance, if you think about the whole minimalist rationale for producing artworks, and the idea of the famous line, we just put one thing after another. Okay, so Carl Andre's bricks, you just put one brick after another brick, then another brick, then another brick. The first brick and the fourth brick don't have a particular need to be there. You can switch them around. It still makes sense in a one thing after another way. You have a structure which makes sense of the whole bricks, but the sequence of bricks from one to the other doesn't have to make sense. All right, just like a library. It seems to me that at least when I think about Brian Dawn's work, that we have the combination of these two kinds of sense, which is to say there's a narrative sense and there's a kind of minimalist sense, insofar as there's always a sort of processual structure that makes sense in terms of Brian Dawn's activity. So there's a kind of hybrid of two forms of sense, where you have this structure of one thing after another, but the sequence of one thing after another also has a narrative sense. So there's a way of making these paintings, for instance. So you do this bit first, and that always happens. And then you do the second bit, and that always comes second. And the second bit, in relation to the first bit, is one thing after another. First I do the faces, then I do the background. But the relationship between these two units is not just one thing after another. He's thinking about who is this woman, and where does she live? So there's a narrative relationship between these two elements, which is not just a one thing after another sequence. The sequence itself makes sense. Okay, I won't take up too much of your time, but what I want to say is that the introduction of narrative into the making sense of making art is always an ethical introduction. There's always an ethical aspect to the kind of narrative that Brian Dawn always deals with in the work. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail about this, but Judith Butler's book from 2005, Giving an Account of Oneself, talks about how narrative is essential to ethical being. We can't be ethical unless we give an account of ourselves, and we can't give an account of ourselves unless we narrativize what we do and why we do it. And so, effectively, for Butler, what we call ethics is what we do as a result of someone saying, why did you do that? And the response to why did you do that must come in a narrative form, which is to say, I wasn't there, I was here instead, and I was busy watching TV, so I couldn't have been there and done the thing that you think that I did. So you give a narrative, or you give a narrative which gives another reason, another narrative for this result that other people think may be bad, but within the narrative that you give, turns out not to be bad at all. I had the best intentions, I did it for these reasons. So you give another narrative to counter the narrative which makes you appear like you've done something wrong. So narrative and ethics have a very strong relationship to one another. And narrative must always be flexible, constructed, be fictional, partial, and opaque, and mediated by language. So narrative cannot just be saying it how it is, telling the truth, expressing yourself. Narrative must be a formation of yourself through giving account of oneself. And finally, what I want to say, after thinking about narrative in relation to ethics and painting, is to say that the giving account of oneself is not restricted to ethics. Giving an account of oneself is what you do if you're an artist. Alright, so artists, whether in the form of the work that you make, or in the panels that you sit on, or having a tutorial, or having a friend round and they say, why do you do that? Or having a family member saying, I just don't get it. calls for you giving an account of yourself. Narrative is therefore an essential part of you constructing what kind of artist you are. Not only to others, but to yourself. So you form yourself as an artistic subject, as an artist, by giving an account of yourself, by taking responsibility for the things that you do. So in that sense, we need, I think, if we're going to talk about Brian Dawn's paintings in terms of narrative, then we need to think about narrative in the broadest possible sense, not only within the work, but in terms of all the narratives that must take place outside of the work in order for the work to have any sense at all.
Please, don't feel you have to make a long sort of speeches when we go there. We can just move around and talk.
We'll talk about that later.
I was just going to add that the lunches I have with Brian or Dawn don't tend to go in that direction, David. So, and just in responding, because you said a lot of very poignant aspects, and one of the things that I feel that this book really marks is not just that relationship between the artist and the biography of how the works are made, which I think is really important, but also it's interesting to think about how those lunches kind of reconfigure your practice, and how whenever we get discussing what you're going to draw or how you draw, it's always in the context of how you're living and how that relates to what kind of subjects might come up in your work. And it seems to me that there's a really important aspect of invisibility around how that's identified as a practice and how that's identified in the making of the work. And that falls into all kinds of kind of queer ontological spaces that are really dominant in terms of what Dawn and Brian do as a split binary that comes together as an artist. So I would say that that's at the forefront of the curiosity and fascination of looking at this work, looking at the videos and understanding how over a long period of time this body of work starts to show the complexity of what it is and to work through some of those themes, such as narrative or possibly a lack of narrative might come up. That's just a response. Does anyone want to say something else?
I think if we go from the idea of narrative to then storytelling, to fiction,
Yeah.
the idea of truth and reality. I'm very interested in the idea of gender as a type of fiction, as a type of storytelling. It's questionable. But maybe, and as people were talking, I also realised that maybe I've known you the longest, actually.
Maybe.
I've known you for the longest. We met
Yeah.
So maybe if we're talking about storytelling and fiction, I'd like to mention the first time that I met you, and you gave me a tutorial in Chelsea back in 1989. And I remember I was showing you my work, and I was talking about feminism and the idea of the feminine within painting. And you said to me, oh, I've got a bit of a feminine side, or something. What is that? And then a few years later, when we were teaching together on the BA course, I think we were in a kind of assessment meeting or a seminar, and I noticed that you had a little sparkly residue on either. I knew nothing at all about Dawn and your alter ego. So I suppose one of the things that I think is interesting is that the idea of, in relation to Brian Dawn, the idea of cross-dressing as something that is both private and intimate, a kind of private storytelling, but also something that's public and demonstrative and provocative. And I wonder sort of where we are with that now, in a time when, in a way, drag and cross-dressing has become quite mainstream in some ways.
Totally.
And it's lost its ability to shock and provoke, which it would have had years earlier.
Yeah.
And I suppose I'd like you to talk a little bit at this point, because I can't remember the story exactly, because maybe I should tell it as I remember it, because all storytelling is a form of a copy of the original. It was your residency up in the north of England where you, and this is burnt into my memory. I can't remember when you told me, where you're working with sort of quite macho
Steelwork.
the steelworks, like macho aesthetic, and then it was something like you would go shopping afterwards to Marks and Spencer's and buy lingerie and take it back to the B&B
Quite possibly.
and dress up. But again, I don't know whether this is my elaboration and embroidering of what you told me, but it's kind of it's certainly burnt into my my memory. So, firstly, was that story true? Was it?
That's what happened.
And also, maybe that's a good point to talk about this idea of the private dressing up, because Dawn Bryan exists in a private way, as a kind of public persona when you're out as an artist or doing it, but also something you do in the bedroom, and in clubs, and so there's a kind of a space in which you exist privately as this kind of double persona, which gender is quite fluid. And I don't know if we really need to go into the complexities of drag at this stage, because it's quite clear that it kind of it undoes the regulatory boundaries between men and female, masculine and feminine. There's a kind of undoing really of gender normativity, but which is performative, and has to do with speech and gesture and body language, and but I think in some ways we all know that. But I think the most interesting thing for me is this private public aspect of the narrative of cross-dressing and drag, having two personas.
I think it's a very relevant moment, maybe, to read Adrian Searle's story. I haven't got glasses. I'm going to try and read this without glasses. But I think it says quite. Brian Dawn Chalkley draws, paints, makes films, dresses up, performs and writes monologues. The stories she has to tell take place in seedy hotel rooms, lonely apartments, in bars and sex clubs, and patches of woodland. I do remember patches of woodland. Obsession, repression, sexual fantasy, secret solitude, and a very bleak kind of humour among the artist's subjects. The work is full of character, and the character is the artist's best invention. The question is not so much who to be today or what story to tell oneself, so much as whether to hoover or to shoot oneself. I think that's my favourite. The frock is on the hanger and the revolver is on the table. Looking at Brian Dawn Chalkley's work, I ask myself, who is the stalker, who is the stalked? And it's very much, that imagery comes out of the drawings. There's quite a few drawings with guns on tables and dresses hanging from walls, but that's a fair description, I think, of some of the complexities of that kind of lifestyle. And I like the kind of, but also I like the kind of fictional element as well. That's more to do with drawings.
Well, picking up from what you were saying, Sylvia, I mean, I'm interested as well in what Dave was saying, thinking of process, and I'm wondering about processing, the way in which you view your work as a form of processing, and this relation of privacy to the confessional. I'm remembering, I've not known you that long, not long enough to know your abstract phase as an artist. I don't know that well, but at some point you moved from this moment of non-narrative to a very active form of narrative processing in your work, which you seem to have some element of, a sort of processing revelatory aspect, and I wonder whether you can talk about that as well.
There was a point when I think there was a body of work that this Dawn creature was sort of lurking around in the background, and I think there was a point when I sort of thought, I won't make any more art, I'll stop, and I'll just go out. That Dawn became the work in a way, but I didn't see it like that. But then, and then there was this terrifying kind of difficulty and fear of exploring this identity, I suppose. And so, like just going out to clubs. And then the more I did that and got over that, these kind of things started to take place as a result of that. So the drawings were really coming out as a diary kind of sense of wanting to kind of relay some of that experience, but not in a very conscious way. But I certainly weren't thinking about them as kind of these are artworks and I'm making up. But I think they just came out as part of a process and a result of that kind of experiential.
You seem to be playing a kind of cat and mouse game with yourself in a way.
Yeah, I am a bit, yeah.
But I was going to say Dawn's diary.
Yeah,
Dawn's diary.
it is really, I suppose, yeah.
Because I'm really fascinated by this, when you're talking about these two.
I mean, this is as
processes
much a
going
conversation piece as a narrative between Brian and Dawn.
Yeah, the conversation, which we have a bit of an extract in that first film, which, sometimes I don't know whether it's right to split them like that, or that I think there's a temptation to say, oh, there's Dawn and there's Brian, but I'm not sure if that gets us very far, really. I think it's that combination of that kind of heritage and bringing in, and finding a voice, maybe.
I mean, that was
How
very
bizarre
initial,
that
you know,
might
I
be,
was almost-
but,
remember that sort of silly TV show from the 1970s where the cartoonist who would put on the glove of the sort of puppet that he was
Yeah.
drawing, he would turn himself into this
Yeah.
funny puppet cat and he was draw a puppet cat in action. Isn't that, obviously that's a very literal rendition of a form of processing that appears manifest in some of your work in this sort of cat and mouse-ish way. I mean, obviously your work's become much more explicit in a later stage, so that's just sort of taking the gloves off, as it were, approach. Whereas before, again, within the narrative, there was that which was not set, but clearly was.
It was a very kind of, maybe not so much now, but it was a very obsessional stage at one point when these drawings were being made. And that was pretty hardcore, sort of experiencing things that maybe these drawings touch on in that sense.
Is there a parallel? Because I mean, my experience of writing screenplays.
Yeah.
I have to become invisible.
Yeah.
It can't be me writing it, because that's like the most boring kind of
Yeah.
thing in the world. So what you do is you become, the people in the tale, and tell their bit through them.
Yes.
And when.
And that's exactly what happens in those paintings in that sense. Because the desire, because I think when those paintings came out of a lot of kind of, I was offered this show and I was showing, they saw some video work and stuff like that. And then I almost started in a kind of very non-representational way with a medium like watercolour, which I'd never used before. Just thought it was straightforward, simple, but it was a very complex messing around with trying to find a form and a figure. And then there was this kind of longing or sort of, almost a sort of substitute for Dawn in a way, because a lot of the earlier work was very much narrative based about the drawings or the voice, the telling the stories. But these seem to be more about a desire and a longing to be that person in a way, or be part of that character, and thinking, oh God, what's she going to wear, and I want to be her, or I don't particularly want to be her, but there's a nicer ones which I think they're really beautiful and sexy and then entering into this, what I think is quite filmic, is the way that this loss of identity, me in, and just being the person. And that's when it clicks. It just, you're in.
Also, she can't know the full story.
No.
She can only know her. She only has her perspective
Yeah.
on the world. She can't know outside that, obviously. But I mean, there are several of them, so I don't know whether they have
and lots of bits of the story. I have no idea.
Wait, could we have that? Ah, great, thank you. Yeah, well, like this one, for instance. You see, she kind of, I mean, there's also kind of deformities that occur. You might say they're deformed, or, well, I mean, I'm not saying deformed, but I mean, the body's kind of awkward. And it's, I mean, I know this is probably not being very research orientated, but I mean, there are parts of it, like the framing of the picture still is stopped there. And then I thought, oh Christ, I better take this in. But I mean, I don't know what's happening here and here, but I want that kind of tension and that kind of desire in what she's wearing and wanting to be her. And somebody said to me once, oh Christ, you do the eyes really well. But I said, I've been spending a long time doing eyebrows. But yeah, but I mean, it sounds a bit superficial, but actually when you're painting it, it's actually real. It's there. I'm not painting an image of eyes, I'm actually wanting to be the eyes.
Yeah, I remember when I came to the show in Shot Martin, we were having a talk about the work, and I can't remember whether you said or I said something about the structuring language of desire.
Oh,
The structuring language of desire.
yeah.
And either you or I said, that's brilliant. So,
Yeah, yeah.
But I think this is what's going on in the drawing. There is a kind of distortion and an obsessive nature in the way that the drawings are done. But they're not certainly not rational or objective. But they're kind of distortions and the strange things that happen on the surface and the obsessiveness and the decoration are very much about the way that desire sort of works. That it's partial, that edits out, it emphasises certain other things.
And that's right, because I think, well, I don't know, could somebody talk about desire?
Well, maybe it's down to how you divide your time. I mean, I'm sure it's not easy to stay in that place.
No.
Could you talk a bit about when you're not in that place, what your work means to you?
I think the work doesn't stay in the same place. I think the work kind of, each time I make a piece of work, I have to go through a process of not wanting to be doing it.
So
It's
yeah.
like an effort, it's a struggle to be there, to get to that point when, I suppose it's an old painting term, or an old art term where, you know, the thing eventually leaves you, if it does, and becomes something apart. If you're still in it, then you throw it away. There has to be that transitional process.
But those spaces in the drawings where you feel that not wantingness become really meaningful. So there's obviously an unconscious acceptance going on at the time. And I'm interested in that relationship to being here, to being involved in education, and to being in a life that doesn't always give you the space you'd like to produce the work, and how you fall into a relationship that tackles that all the time.
Yeah, I've never been, I don't think I'm an artist that actually would like to be in that space the whole time. And I think that part of the teaching is really so important in terms of my practice. I don't find that kind of distance and say, you know, oh, there's the teaching, then I make art paint. I think the two, because I've been in that process for so long, I think the two kind of interrelate in that sense. And I've taught from the perspective, I think, of, in my head, of actually making work on a kind of very close relationship between us.
But it's never 100% comfortable. It's always
No, I don't want
discussion.
it. No, I don't think it ever should become.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have something?
Well, I think when you're dealing with work that has got this kind of autobiographical, diaristic element, I think we can fall into patterns of thinking where we start to assume that these are your narrative, and I think we can think of them in a different way. I think, you know, it's more. I think that we tell ourselves stories all the time, and we tell ourselves stories, and we tell each other stories about ourselves in order to try and find out who we actually are. So the storytelling is almost like the process by which we try to become less opaque to ourselves, which never works.
No, it doesn't.
So the stories are not the story of yourself. The stories are the things that you tell yourself in order to try and find out something about yourself. So the stories are always somehow kind of failed stories, or attempts and drafts and things that you will later on come to think of as being, maybe even you start to believe the stories rather than the experiences and things like that. And sometimes you reject the stories and say, I was just lying to myself that whole time. So I don't think that we should identify the images with the person. I think we should see the images as the process, part of the process by which you relate to yourself.
You could identify the images as a fictional entity of a person, and it's on those grounds they carry a different register of meaning. But only if they're seen as a fictional form of production, and only if they're seen as identified as outside of a conscious sense of either Brian or Dawn, they have their own life, but then they carry a real significance later on.
Well, I think that's why it's misleading to try to divide Brian and Dawn, because I don't think that you could say, oh, this is Brian's story or this is Dawn's story, and I don't think you could say, well, these are Brian's values and these are Dawn's values. And in a sense, we need to think about how both Brian and Dawn are narratives, and two of possible other, like maybe there are more narratives, and those narratives are the way that this nameless person can survive, and they work for the time being. Do you know what I mean?
It's only talk about repertoire. They're available.
Yeah.
An artist has a repertoire,
Yeah.
or a performer, and in a sense that's a sense I have in your work as well, that you're reaching into different sort of pockets for inspiration.
And also, I'd imagine that Dawn has allowed certain kinds of activities to take place that Brian wouldn't have allowed you
It's very
to
true.
do.
It's
But
very
also
true.
that over the time, Dawn changes from allowing these things to happen to allowing these other things to happen. So it's not a kind of fixed thing. It's something. It's an identity that you can not only take on, wear, but that can change, or you can change, or it can change independently of you.
Yeah.
And then you then have to make a decision. You know what I mean? Like, it's going this way. What am I going to do about that?
Yeah.
Am I going to go with that way, or am I going to try and pull it back? You know what I mean? So it's not a fixed thing, and it's not something that you author in a kind of classic sense of you having an intention that is transparent to you, which you then just execute. It just isn't that kind of process, I think. I don't think it's that process, even for someone with one name.
That's the best sort of story. It has to be beyond you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It has to be.
The best stories have to be beyond you. They have to feel alien to you in a way. So it's like it can't be you can't feel in control of it. That's part of making yourself disappear. You have to feel that you are going somewhere you do not know where you're going.
And that's very interesting, because I went to an interview with Harold Pinter and Michael Billington once, and I was very interested in Harold Pinter's work. And there was a question from the audience. It was a very interesting discussion. They'd known each other for years now. Anyway, the first question from the audience was, and Harold Pinter sitting there, and he said, this person who said, how do you come up with your ideas? And then there was this dreadful silence of about, seemed like minutes. And Pinter just looked at him with utter disdain and said, ideas? I've never had an idea in my life. But one thing he did say, he said the characters in his plays don't want him to be in the story. The characters resist his presence, and they resist to a final end. And also, when he's writing those characters, he just calls them A, B, C, and D. He's right at the end that he then names them.
There's another thing.
And this is a process I'm very interested in terms of.
that's fantastic. And also, Peter was asked famously by an actor about this actor, about his character's motivation.
Yeah.
Peter said, mind your own fucking business.
Yeah. Yeah.
It always you do what you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's. I did some writing recently where to try and get around to escape me, I go and meet people and hear their stories, and instantly got that thing where someone very close to you is in trouble. If I'm sitting there trying to decide how this character will behave, it is not as interesting or as true or as wonderful as someone else's story who's telling me from their own experience.
Yeah.
And that's sort of, it's like, oh, I might just decide I need to catch number 73 bus and have a cup of tea in the face of the world disappearing. And I just wondered if you've done any of that. I mean, it isn't research. It is asking for other people's stories to.
Well, I mean, there was a period in the work where I was going to clubs and I ended up sort of sitting talking to people. I always remember this man telling me, he was married as he usually are, living a double life, but he was saying that the club, this sort of, where there's a lot of different activities going on, we won't go into that, but he was telling me this story about how he got so obsessed with the club that at one point he realised that he was feeling quite hungry, and he said that he rushed down the street to a hamburger bar, and he was so obsessed in getting back to the club that it was like it completely taken over the whole situation, that he was eating his food and he was running back to the club. And I was interested in that, but it was a long story he was telling me, but it was a beautiful story in the sense that an incredibly kind of it was a kind of reality about it, I suppose. And there was a couple of situations like that where I was starting to make, and Donald's here, but Donald and I used to sit down and we would record these stories. I said, I've got a story, Donald. He's sitting there, Donald Smith and sit there at the top, and then I would get the tape recorder out and I'd just tell this narrative with I tried writing them, but it didn't work, so I just did it from memory, and I could remember the conversations and the voices. And there's a little bit of it on that other film, but so going back to that, that sense of the story told from someone, it's a really powerful thing rather than me trying to paint that.
I'm also reminded of a filmmaker like Haneke with these. I'm reminded, the director Haneke.
Michael Haneke.
Yeah. I mean, I'm reminded so much by these little frames because, well, for starters, his obsession with pushing the main action outside.
Yeah. Yes, that's
And you become a very active viewer a lot.
Because that's it. I mean, I think
you're jointly telling the tale.
I mean, that's probably quite an interesting example where there's this kind of fearful, and you know it's the gaze out, where the action is outside, rather than the action being on the inside. And that's a very interesting place for me.
And even more when they're just interiors.
Yeah. What do you think we ought to?
Yeah.
I mean, if anybody feels the need to ask a question, for God's sake, But I mean, we have a very eminent panel here, I'm aware of, that's far sharper than I would be. But so, if there is anybody who would like to ask a question.
Sure.
You mentioned a little bit about the role of education within your kind of practice. But I thought maybe you could say a little bit more about how that's played a role in how you developed your relationship with the college and...
Have I got to answer that?
You're not going to answer that?
Have I got to answer that?
Yeah.
No, I will. No. Okay. So, this is going to sound really soapy. Awful, you know. But I've always thought from the moment I started teaching, it's just such a privilege to be doing it. Because it wasn't meant, in terms of where I've come from, meant to be my career or my privilege to do what I do, you know. So it's miraculous, that's all I can say. It's absolutely miraculous that I should be doing that in this position. That's all I can say. I know it sounds like I'm saying that to you, but that's true, you know.
Brian, that was quite soapy.
And I think what?
That was quite soapy.
That was, yeah, I know it was, but I think, oh, fuck it, all right. Well, I don't want to, let's get another question.
I just wanted to add on.
Maybe the team could answer. Go on. Yeah.
Going on from what Dave said about sort of the act to survive, I kind of wanted to just maybe add about the event of the painting, and I suppose also going through maybe with Judith Butler and sort of the contingency of it, and it sort of acting as a democratic event, like when you stand in front of the painting. It came up in a talk a little while ago, but you know, do you see it as like a democratic event?
Did you come forward a bit? Because I gave you a word. I'm deaf.
We can't hear it back either.
Oh, okay, sorry. I just want to say, I suppose the vulnerability in the painting and.
Well, is there vulnerability in the painting?
Well, this is the question. I mean, is it a democratic event with the painting? I mean, is the painting a democratic event when it's displayed? And you know, like, does it act in contingent ways in a vulnerable or an act to survive at times? Do you ever feel like that, or do you ever perceive?
Maybe I just want to paint something. You know, I don't know. I mean, survive. I mean, they're very big things, aren't they? I don't know.
Well, I mean, yeah, from your experiences of actually being drawn as well, you know, are there ever experiences where you kind of survive as drawn, where there might be vulnerabilities in public space?
It might. I mean, the whole thing might be a kind of temporary solution to something, but I think it's very temporary. Yeah. And maybe the work's temporary, has a temporariness about it, you know. At that moment in time there might be some kind of sense of something, I don't know what, that's kind of worth pursuing.
Sort of in its multiplicities as a narrative.
The thing that is grating for me is this: you keep using the word painting in the singular, and I don't know of any painters who paint in the singular. They paint in a repetitive, structured, temporal way. So I don't imagine a painter standing in front of a painting. I think of a painter as having a routine, and they go to the studio and they work in the way that they work, and they reflect in the way that they reflect, and that is as well as being each one being temporary, you also have this other temporality, this overarching practice. That's what we call it, isn't it? So the idea of this, I don't know, like spiritual relationship to this object that you're making is not how I imagine it to be. In that, you know, that kind of one-on-one, it's this alien being and me. You know what I mean? I think of it as much more. This is this is part of, could be part of, almost like there's a set, what makes it fleeting, or one of the aspects of it being fleeting is this thing that I'm making now could be part of my practice, but it might not be. So in that sense, the event, you don't know if the event's taken place until weeks, maybe months later. Do you know what I mean? So it's not, you're not painting now in one sense, or you're not painting this now. You'll find out whether you've painted it later. So it's a different kind of temporality. And I think it's very difficult to think of making art of any kind, not just painting, in terms of this isolated, one-off event. You know, it takes place in a different kind of complex, reflective temporality.
Say something about just about the notion of temporality, because it's really interesting because I saw the exhibition of the paintings when we were in London.
Yeah.
And you were Brian there.
Yeah. Yeah. The ancient modern
externally anyway, even
yeah.
writing being done internally, which I wouldn't have known. But for me, what's really fascinating at the moment is seeing them in this kind of technical way, and I can see a double image because I can see the computer, I can see the screen, and I can see you. And so me just talking about that temporality, what was it that I was seeing? I was seeing those paintings, and I've seen you, and now I'm seeing those paintings again, and I'm seeing you, and they've changed dramatically. The narratives changed dramatically, and for me, I think perhaps the most, I'm not surprised, but the interesting thing is that you said that you painted the backgrounds on backwards, and I didn't know when I saw those paintings that they were wish fulfillments in a sense, or a fantasy of this other, and so that's, as I say, I just wanted to say for me to have experienced the paintings in the gallery and to experience you in relation to these images now has been really fascinating.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. It might be worth saying something a little bit. I mean, I think we've been going on a bit long now, but I mean, the way they're painted was very awkward for me. It's like crap, you know. It's just like painting rubbish. And the whole thing of those paintings goes against everything. Maybe Dave's talking about formalism a little bit. But, you know, it's shockingly, painting those was shockingly embarrassing, you know. It was really, I didn't want to look at them. Or every time I went through past the doorway, I looked at this woman staring at me, I was like, oh my God, it's so bad, you know, it's so horrible and bad. And Jeanette's going to say in a minute, yeah, that was another soapy thing you just said, and she's probably right. And how dare I align myself to an artist? Well, I'm just thinking of an example of what Philip Guston said once, and I think he's great at writing about painting and this process, and this madness of this process, where he was painting the kind of things he was known for, which was like, people used to call it impressionistic abstract painting, where they were kind of very painted, a kind of abstraction going. And then he had this kind of real dilemma about thinking, why am I carrying on doing that? And broke from that in one strange way to painting the Ku Klux Klan pictures. And he talked about, God knows when he slept, but he talked about painting the abstract paintings in the daytime, and in the night time he'd go back and paint these really embarrassing kind of paintings of these figures, you know, but painted beautifully, of course. And I'm kind of fascinated by that how he got himself into that kind of position to be able to have to do that. And I kind of relate to that a little bit, in the sense that, I mean, Dave said, well, I think they might have said this before in this conversation, but there was a talk at the Royal College, Sadie organised, and Dave said afterwards something like, oh, well, Brian's got a lot of catching up to do with Dawn, because Dawn's coming from it without the kind of, a lot of baggage. She's coming from a very kind of desire or sensuality or sexuality thing, was Brian was kind of, well, Brian the formalist, I suppose, from Chelsea, 1969, 78, you know, all that stuff. And I think that was really important in this work, that to kind of confront some of the horribleness of those paintings, in the sense that they went against everything I thought art should be or taught, to trying to find some kind of crazy sort of fucked up kind of world that I was inhabiting in the night time.
And I think you can see that relationship between the formal and the narrative and the drawings. Because I found the drawings very formal in the way that they're structured. You know, these cubes, which you know, the lines articulate quite a formal space. And then when you look, you see something, you know, various narrative
Quite
events.
horrible going on in it.
Something horrible. Well, some of them are just bleak, and some of them are kind of vaguely alarming.
Alarming.
And when I was looking at them in bed last night. I only got a copy of the
Say,
book.
don't do that.
And I was sort of looking at my room and thinking, it's my room, like, this sort of bleakness. And I suppose one of the things about the drawings is I thought they looked like a little bit like stage sets, and given the theatricality and qualitative, I thought this makes some kind of sense. But they're like stage sets maybe that are either in construction or before, when they're setting up and being disassembled. And then I thought about the characters who are acting and appear in these kind of half-assembled theatrical spaces. And it reminded me a little bit of, I mean, it's a kind of long shot, but Watteau's Comedy Française, where you see these figures who are dressed up to play a part. But you're not sure whether it's dress rehearsal or they're just interacting on another level. They've got their own private thing going on. So I wasn't sure, in some ways, whether I was looking at someone performing a role or a play, or they were in a private moment or privately interacting with kind of between takes, between rehearsals, which for me made them, again within this curiously formal space, which relates to some of the paintings we were making in that show that I curated years and years and years ago.
And I think also in that book there's the dreadful anonymity of the relationships, searching for this second or two of closeness, and it fractures, or it just can't be sustained. So there's this kind of gap between the struggle to find some kind of contact, but the unbearability of the contact becoming more than a second or two, or the orgasmic moment, you know. And the other thing I thought we haven't touched on briefly, and I think we've got to stop, is on here there's some titles, that all the titles in these works are like narratives in themselves, and they come from magazines that I've read, so there might be a model in there, and I'm saying, I don't know if we can get the titles briefly, but no, we can't. Okay, don't worry about that. But they come, all the titles come out in magazines, and so what models have said or something like that. So I kind of link that to the image, but that comes right at the end. So there's different sets of linkages coming together in order to make this kind of this fragmentary kind of awkward sort of sets of relationships that, so the titles are really important. So I mean there's some titles in here, but I think that these are not long ones. But anyway, so I think that's it. I'd like to just say thanks to the audience, but I'd also very much thank the panel. It's been brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.